Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. My name is Ursula Neuner, and I will be emceeing today's event, Bonita Vista's second annual TEDx Conference. Before introducing the speakers, I'd like to talk about our organization. TEDxBonitaVistaHS was founded 2 years ago by a group of 4 seniors, Catherine Neuner, my older sister, Kimberly Lindquist, Pablo Quadros, and Jitek Kim. Their goal was to create an annual event to bring pride to our school, to inspire our classmates, and to offer a platform for students and members of our community to share their unique stories. We held our first conference of April 2019, and we were excited to begin planning the 2020 conference soon after. As we all know, March of last year was when the COVID-19 pandemic was first spreading throughout the US. Just a few weeks before our conference date, we unfortunately had to cancel the event due to social distancing guidelines. In the beginning of this school year, myself and 6 other seniors, Derek Chopik, Evan Abutin, Cambria McClelland, Gerardo Gonzalez, Anushka Savgar, and Alexis Emch, wanted to host our second annual conference. We had no idea what to expect. We didn't know whether or not we would even be able to host a live conference this year. We faced a lot of major obstacles. But in the spirit of TED, we had to be innovative and open-minded to overcome these difficulties. Now, after a year of preparation, we are so happy to present to you our second annual conference. It's definitely different than the conference we held 2 years ago, but our goal remains the same: to share the unique perspectives of different members of our community. This year's theme is Weathering the Storm, successfully overcoming difficulties and adapting to change. This theme reflects challenges we've faced organizing a completely virtual conference. And on a much larger scale, the pandemic and racial barriers the world faces today. Our speakers will share major obstacles they've overcome throughout their lives. Lastly, before introducing our speakers, I'd like to thank our advisor, Mr. Jason Good, an International Baccalaureate English teacher here at Bonita Vista High. Without your guidance over the past 3 years, this event truly could not have happened. With that, we will now begin our program. Our first speaker today is a Yale graduate with a Bachelor of Science in Neuroscience. She is a first-generation Telugu American who has a strong curiosity for the sciences and a deep appreciation for the traditions of her Hindu culture. Today, she will explore the long-held debate between science and tradition. Without further ado, with her speech titled, What Scientists and Grandmas Can Learn from Each Other, please welcome Snigdha Nandipati.
This is my grandma. She's one of the wisest women I know, but it usually takes me some time to fully understand her words of wisdom. Growing up, my brother and I were never allowed to blow out the candles on our birthday cakes. We were taught that light is a symbol of life, and to blow it out was taboo. It wasn't until years later, until this year in fact, when COVID hit, that I realized the meaning behind her words. It turns out that when we blow out candles on birthday cakes, we're essentially spraying our spit and germs all over this cake, which we're then feeding to friends and family. That's pretty gross. Well, scientists at Clemson University came to the same conclusion a couple of years ago when they published a peer-reviewed article that quantified the amount of bacteria that accumulates due to candle blowing. How is it that my grandma, who was equipped solely with her cultural traditions and her 6th grade education, was able to arrive at the same conclusion decades before these renowned scientists? It's because science and tradition are really just 2 different sides of the same coin. Tradition tells us what to do, and science explains why we should do it. For example, the traditions laid out in the Bhagavad Gita tell us about the practice of meditation. When the great warrior Arjuna was on the Kurukshetra battlefield, he was frozen into inaction due to his feelings of guilt and attachment. His friend and acting charioteer, Lord Krishna, helps to guide him back to a sense of purpose using techniques such as role transition and mindfulness. These techniques have since become deeply embedded in the Hindu tradition. Science then goes on to explain why we should meditate. It turns out that modern cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, uses these techniques of role transition and mindfulness to reduce amygdala activation and cortisol levels, which means we're reducing our fear and stress response. Science and tradition both work to answer the same essential questions of human nature. They just do so from different perspectives. Unfortunately, science and tradition have a long history of disagreement. From the heliogeocentric debate between Galileo and the Catholic Church to the debate between Ayurvedic homeopathy and modern allopathic medicine, we've seen far too many examples of what happens when science and tradition butt heads. No wonder we've come to regard the two as worlds apart, even mutually exclusive. Why did this storm between science and tradition arise in the first place? To understand that, we need to first learn that tradition was created with a certain intent, a certain purpose in mind. Be it the morning ritual of drinking turmeric and honey ginger tea, or the taboo against blowing out candles on birthday cakes, tradition has withstood the test of time to carry the accumulated knowledge of our ancestors across generations. But over time, we grew blind to the original intent, the original purpose behind these traditions, and we've corrupted them in the process. Take menstrual practices in India as an example. To perform chores back in the day, women had to walk long distances to fetch water to boil rice and vegetables. They had to wash clothes by hand by beating them on a rock. They had to carry heavy loads on their back and their hip. Today's scientific research shows us what our ancestors already knew, that heavy lifting during menses puts immense strain on the womb. To prevent potential harm to the woman, our ancestors ensured that the husband would take over the household chores during those few days. But over time, we grew blind to the intent behind those traditions. And now we tell women that they cannot step foot into the kitchen, that they cannot touch the laundry, that they cannot perform puja to God. What began as a way to give relief to women from these responsibilities during these few days turned into a taboo that saw women and their periods as filthy and impure. See, tradition is like a mango on a tree. In the beginning, the mango is raw and bitter, and no one really likes it. When that same mango ripens, it becomes sweet to the taste and everyone loves it. But once its window of time passes, the mango can become rotten if it's not picked off the tree and preserved properly. Think about how you make mango preserves. You take the mango, you mash it up, you slice it up. It no longer looks like the mango that you began with, but the original mango taste is the same. The same principle applies to preserving our traditions. When we take the traditions of our past to fit the needs of our present, they may not look the same any longer, but we have to ensure that the original taste, the original intent is preserved. Now, tradition isn't the only one that's undergone corruption like this. Science has gone through the same corruption. See, science at its core is a humble curiosity of our world and of ourselves. But over time, we've lost that humility. We sit atop our ivory towers of science, looking down at anyone who can't possibly understand us. We think them to be stupid or ignorant or just outright evil. Take the example of controlling forest fires, an all too familiar problem here in California. For thousands of years, the indigenous tribes of California, including the Yurok and Hupa, have practiced the tradition of controlled burning. So by burning old brush, they not only prevented larger and more dangerous wildfires from occurring, but they also regenerated food resources and habitats for animals. Unfortunately, scientists and ecologists of the National Forest Service thought these traditions to be primitive and destructive, And so they moved to outlaw these groups from migrating and from practicing their tradition of controlled burning. It wasn't until 100 years later that these laws were finally discovered to be harmful and dangerous to the environment. But so much of the forest has been lost in that time. For so long, the scientific community has arrogantly brushed aside traditions that have offered hope to people for so many years. And in the same vein, cultural leaders have vehemently opposed scientific advancement out of fear that the rapid progress of science would mean the ruin of their age-old traditions. These mutual misunderstandings have fueled this divide between science and tradition, and we've since been forced to choose sides. There is a way out of this storm, however. If we can restore the original ideals and core values of both science and tradition, we can bridge them back together in our search for truth and understanding. Firstly, we must ensure that we harness the traditional knowledge of our past such that it is applicable to our world today. For example, Yale professor Yung-Chi Chang and his team recently discovered a new drug that promises to treat cancer with minimal side effects. Pretty cool, huh? But guess what? His drug was inspired by the traditional herbal medicines described in ancient Chinese texts from thousands of years ago. By using tradition to inspire his search, Professor Chang has literally pioneered a new path in the field of pharmacology and cancer research. That being said, we must also remember the original intent and purpose behind our traditions. We can do so using the scientific method, which teaches us to question the limitations of our existing body of knowledge and dares us to ask why. See, the storm between science and tradition is one that cannot go unresolved. If we want to make innovation accessible to everyone, we have to reframe our scientific knowledge into frameworks of tradition that people are familiar with. To do so, traditional knowledge must go hand in hand with modern science. We must both learn from the knowledge of our past and learn to question the limitations of that knowledge. Only then can we make progress available to all. So instead of being forced to choose one or the other, let's learn to value both. Let's revisit our traditions with the eye of a scientist, and let's restore the humility of science with inspiration from our grandma's traditions. Thank you.
Our second speaker is today's first student speaker. Growing up, he experienced many hardships, being expelled from multiple high schools for various wrongdoings and crimes. However, he was able to turn his life around. Now, he's a social media influencer with over 1 million followers and a youth leader at his local church. Today, he will tell his inspiring story in his speech, I Never Thought. Please welcome Jaden Pacheco.
I never thought I would ever do a TED Talk in my life. I never thought growing up I'd be a somebody. This is my story, how I overcame the storm. My childhood at a young age was different. I would constantly fight with my parents every single day. Sometimes I'll get physical. I barely had any friends growing up. My own father was mentally abusive towards me and my mother. My football coach said to me, I suck and I'm a failure in front of my whole football team. Elementary school was mentally challenging for me. My peers and my own family constantly reminded me how skinny I was. This affected me. I was only a child and I felt weak, insecure, hopeless, and alone. I truly believed this was normal for a kid my age, until I realized, as I got older and a little bit wiser, families are supposed to support you, not hurt you. Coaches are supposed to lift you up, not bring you down. Friends are supposed to be there with you, not leave you. I never thought my life would never get better. The storm was slowly consuming me bit by bit. A couple years passed by. I'm attending at Eastlake Middle School. I'm now a 7th grader. This is the new chapter of my life. The biggest one, the creation of Jaden Pacheco. I was very popular throughout my middle school and high school years, but for the wrong reasons. People knew me as Pacheco, the well-known, young, mischievous, ignorant, loud, and chaotic teenager you'll ever meet. I created that reputation. Without me realizing, I would fuel this reputation. I would fight with other students over disagreements and school altercations. I would consistently argue with my teachers just so I could show my dominance. My grades were just straight D's and F's. I never focused in class. On the weekends, I would create havoc within the Eastlake community just so I could be liked and accepted by my peers. I would ignorantly post myself all over social media to see. Everyone saw all the stuff I was doing. Everyone knew me, but nobody wanted to be associated with me. I had no friends. I had no one to rely on, no one to talk to but myself. All of my teachers were disappointed in me. They believed I was going to fail, not just in school, but in life. I started getting suspended frequently. My parents were on edge of divorce. Family arguments started to get worse. I never thought my life would never get better, and it didn't. I was diagnosed with ADHD and ADD and was forced to take prescribed medication every single day. I was never the same. My creativity and thinking was stripped away from me. My faith to persevere was weakened. This dark presence took me under its wing. It controlled me. It consumed every bit of me. My life will never get better, I told myself. But something deep inside me, a violet flame that was powerful, told me, your hardest times will lead to your greatest victories. Keep the faith and never give up. So I overcame my challenges. I'm now a freshman. It's my first year of high school, and this is how I got here. I was enrolled in Eastlake High School. Still, I was judged, criticized, and viewed as an outcast by the Eastlake community. The path I was taking was dark, lonely, and forgotten. The reputation I had created had successfully changed my fate. I believed what society told me, a failure. Everything going in my life had corrupted me. A human being to believe that he has no purpose, no virtues, no integrity, just so he can end up as another statistic because society said so. I told my family I wanted to leave schools. I was alone, left out, judged, excluded because of my mistakes and my wrongdoings. I was all alone. So I left. I just wanted to be liked. I never thought my life would never get better. The storm has successfully consumed me. The flame I once had was dying. I'm now at Olympian High School. At Olympian High School, I made friends with everyone. I got to experience different varieties of groups, people, and teachers. It felt like a fresh start, but my reputation still remained. Instead of me improving and becoming focus-driven, I got worse, a lot worse. Students discovered who I was, the mischievous and one and only Jaden Pacheco. I was fueling my fire, and I loved it. My third day at Olympian High School, I was suspended for selling marijuana. After my suspension, I was switched to a study skills class, a class full of students with learning disabilities. And that's when I met my wonderful teacher, Miss Treadwell. She was the only teacher who saw the born, natural leader in me. She was loving, caring, and most of all, my mentor. When she told me I was a leader, I refused to believe her. My bad habits and the people I surrounded myself with have fully influenced me. Every day was a chaos to the community. Destruction, stealing, fighting, selling, all so I can maintain my social power. Miss Treadwell was just trying to help me, and I failed her. Olympian High School had to get rid of me. They gave me too many chances. So they did. I was the example of a failure. I never thought my life would never get better. And it didn't. My only option was to go to Grossmont High School. I had no choice. Towards the end of my first semester, my parents finally divorced. I was strongly put in the middle. I was the glue in my parents' relationship, but that glue finally decayed. My life was going down. My parents finally divorced. I lost all my friends. I was becoming the failure that everyone said I was going to be. I never thought my life would never get better. The first 2 weeks at Grossmont High School, I ditched all my classes. I didn't show up to one. I hated making new friends. I hated the school. I didn't want to be there. But one day, I met this student. He was in my study skills class. And we decided to ditch school that day. And the next thing you know, we were arrested, put in handcuffs in the back of a police vehicle because we broke in and entered someone's home. I never thought my life would never get better. Grossmont High School expelled me while my friend was suspended. I was forced to go to a continuation school called Chaparral High School. Chaparral High School had the reputation of having the worst of the worst students in history. I never thought my life would never get better. They treat us like kids. A school full of non-educated juveniles with no plan, no ambition, no future, because society failed them because they failed themselves. I was one of them. These were my people. A couple weeks passed by. I was called into the office to talk to our local police officer named Officer Ellers. I went into his office and sat down right in front of him, and I will remember to this day what he told me. Jaden, I see something in you, and you don't belong here. I argued, Officer Ellers, I do belong here. I broke into someone's home. Jaden, do you know students who go to Chaparral High School end up getting killed, homeless, or jail? You, my friend, don't belong here. I'll never forget what he told me that day. So I left Chaparral High School, and I never looked back. I never thought my life would never get better. I was fighting, persevering, having the strong resilience, and helping my way out of the storm. I'm now a sophomore. My crucial year, the breakthrough of changing my mindset. I went back to Eastlake High School in order to face my problems. A conscious setback that I was running away from my problems. It was a risk that was needed. I was afraid of change. I was afraid of facing my own adversity. I was stuck in this dark cycle and kept retracing my footsteps over and over again. I was tired of losing. I was tired of being viewed as a failure. I was tired of being weak. I'm tired of running away. I'm not letting the storm win. I was tired of it all. I changed my mindset to believe every setback is a stepping stone for growth. After making this conscious decision, I lost my group of friends because I was separating myself from the crowd wanting to do better, to make things right in my life. But it came with a price. I had to separate the old Jaden from the new Jaden. I had to make the hardest decision of my life, taking the first step without seeing the whole staircase. To have faith, to believe in the not yet seen, to believe that no trial, no tribulation can't stop me but me, to believe in myself, to discover every difficulty lies great opportunity, to have resilience through adversity, to understand and know the power of responsibility and picking yourself back up. My name is Jan Pacheco. I am a social media influencer with over 1 million followers. I have multiple guided mentors who are helping me achieve my lifetime goals. To become an upcoming motivational speaker, a successful YouTuber, and most of all, an entrepreneur. I am also a youth leader at my local church and a community club activist to help other students improve themselves. And by hearing my story and how I overcame my storm, you would have never thought I would be here giving this TED Talk. Thank you.
Truly inspiring. Thank you, Jaden. Our next speaker grew up in a small town in Nicaragua during the end of the Somoza dictatorship, the early years of the Sandinista Revolution of 1979, and the Contra War of the early 1980s. She is the first woman of Nicaraguan ancestry to obtain a PhD in Latin American history from a U.S. university. Please join us in welcoming Dr. Victoria Gonzalez Rivera with her speech, Changing the Narrative on Central America.
Thank you for inviting me to be here with you today. I am the daughter of a Nicaraguan man and a white woman from the United States. I grew up in Nicaragua during the last few years of the right-wing Somoza dictatorship, one that lasted 43 years and was supported until the very end by the U.S. government and U.S. tax dollars. I also lived through the early years of the leftist Sandinista revolution that overthrew the Somoza dictatorship in 1979. And my teenage years coincided with the Contra War. The Contra War against the Sandinista revolution was one that was largely funded by the United States and lasted for most of the 1980s. My life has been shaped by dictatorship, revolution, and counter-revolution, as well as by the long-standing ties between Nicaragua and the United States. Not surprisingly, perhaps, given my background, I went on to obtain a PhD in Latin American history, precisely to better understand and address these very complicated and interconnected histories. As a university professor, I now write books and articles on Nicaraguan history, and I teach courses on U.S. and Latin American history, including the history of people of Mexican and Central American ancestry in the United States. When most people in the United States today think about Central America and Central Americans, they think about violence. The assumption in the U.S. is that Central Americans are somehow inherently violent people, more so than white folks. In other words, many in the U.S. believe that Central Americans are somehow unable to extricate themselves from violence because that is who we are. And most crucially, they believe that it is who we are meant to be. Another common stereotype about Central Americans is that our arrival in the U.S., and most importantly, our relationship to the United States, is a relatively recent phenomenon dating back to the wars of the 1980s. Violent newcomers to the United States. That is how we, Central Americans in the U.S., are often viewed today. But that view is actually one that distorts, erases, and replaces historical facts with a gaslighting narrative that dehumanizes Central Americans in the US and Central Americans in Central America. Let me address then the issue of violence and the supposedly recent relationship that the US has with Central America in order to help us change the current narrative on Central America. It is not difficult to figure out the reasons for the current violence in Central America. Journalists, scholars, and activists have painstakingly documented how much of the violence in Central America today is linked to drug cartels and the seemingly insatiable demand for drugs in the United States. Contemporary violence in Central America is also a byproduct of the region's civil wars that took place in the 1970s and 1980s, and a direct result of continued US political, economic, and military involvement in the region since then, often supported by a handful of local actors who are, more often than not, corrupt politicians and or members of the elites. The Central American civil wars of the late 20th century were ones in which the United States was heavily involved, since the US government saw them as proxy wars through which to fight the so-called Cold War against the former Soviet Union. In other words, the Cold War was cold only for those countries that didn't experience war on their soil. Central America was never cold during the Cold War. In fact, hundreds of thousands of Central Americans died as a result of these Cold War-related conflicts, sometimes massacred at the hands of US-trained soldiers who fired US-made guns. The fact that in the 1980s, the United States fought the Cold War in Central America and not on US soil is no coincidence. It was a way to fight against the supposed threat of communism without subjecting the people within the borders of the United States to violence, destruction, and trauma. Simply stated, the violence that Central Americans suffered meant that people in the US were spared. The US won the Cold War, and the Central American lives that were lost in the process from the US military perspective were simply the expected collateral damage. US involvement in Central America, however, predates the Cold War. In high school, most US students learn about the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. That year, US President Monroe proclaimed that only the United States had the right to control the affairs of peoples in Latin America, in effect declaring that the newly independent region would no longer be influenced by European colonial powers. Instead, they would be subject to the whims of their neighbor to the north. The Monroe Doctrine, along with the ideology of manifest destiny, helps explain how Central America went from being colonized by Spain and Britain to being considered the United States' backyard. While most students in the US learn about manifest destiny, that is, the belief that the United States was destined to expand its territory, students often learn little about its consequences in Central America. The lack of historical knowledge is one of the reasons why so many people in the US do not know that this country has an ongoing, centuries-old relationship with Central America and Central Americans. And that from the very beginning, it was an unequal relationship that benefited the United States economically, politically, and militarily at the expense of Central Americans. In short, as many scholars and immigration activists have pointed out before me, Central Americans are here in the US because the US was there in Central America. And nothing illustrates the history of US intervention in Central America more than the story of William Walker, the most infamous of all 19th century filibusters. Filibusters back then was the term used to refer to adventurers who, like Walker, were inspired by manifest destiny to invade countries the United States was not formally at war with in order to colonize them for their own benefit. William Walker was born in 1824 in Nashville, Tennessee. He studied medicine, then law, and eventually turned to journalism before leaving the United States to invade first Mexico in 1853 and then Nicaragua in 1855. William Walker initially arrived in Nicaragua to aid members of the Nicaraguan Liberal Party in their ongoing civil war against the Conservative Party. Walker, however, had his own agenda, and instead of helping out the liberals, he quickly proclaimed himself president of Nicaragua, instituted English as the official language, and legalized the enslavement of people of African ancestry, a colonial practice that had been abolished in Central America decades earlier, as early as 1824 in much of the region. Walker did not take over Nicaragua on his own. He convinced approximately 12,000 men and women from the United States, the vast majority of them white, to join him in his settler colonialist endeavor, promising them land that he intended to steal from those Nicaraguans who did not support him. Walker and fellow filibusters believed that by Americanizing Nicaragua, they were doing Nicaraguans a favor. Walker was able to garner the support of white U.S. Americans and white men in particular by appealing to their racism. He called the wars in Central America a war of the races, the great battle of the mongrels and the white men. Walker, in fact, saw the main problem in the Central American isthmus to be a racial one, and he wrote, "Mongralism was the secret of its waning fortune. What was to be done? It was left for us to Americanize Central America, on whom rests the right of regenerating the amalgamated race on no other than the people of the United States, and especially of the southern states. I call upon you to execute this mission," end quote. Once they realized the threat they were facing, Central American forces united against Walker and his followers. Walker was eventually captured by Central Americans and shot to death in Honduras in 1860. Walker's imperialist efforts in Central America failed, but the United States has continued its involvement in the region, usually under the pretense that it knows what is best for Central Americans and that Central Americans agree with this assessment. How can we reconcile the historical reality of almost 200 years of U.S. imperialism in Central America with the gaslighting narrative that claims Central Americans are violent strangers? The truth is we can't. The false narrative about Central Americans is meant to make people forget the historical violence that the U.S. has perpetrated against Central Americans, suggesting instead that Central Americans are the dangerous ones. I was invited to talk about weathering storms and successfully overcoming difficulties. I actually became a historian because of the false narratives about Central America. They did not sit right with me. I wanted to understand why the misinformation about Central America was so rampant. And I also wanted to know what the historical evidence actually showed. Learning our collective histories is a way of healing together and charting a new way forward that is not based on lies and half-truths, but on the recognition that at this point, we are inextricably connected. Past harm first introduced Central Americans to U.S. Americans. Let's acknowledge that past so that we can address the current challenges in the most just manner possible, centering the needs of those who have been harmed the most. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rivera. Our next speaker is a junior at Bonita Vista High School. As a Latina and a Sephardic Jew, she has faced discrimination and anti-Semitism. Her ancestors fled persecution in the Middle East, resettled in Mexico, and eventually crossed the border to the United States. Today, She will discuss her experiences growing up as a minority within a minority. Introducing Anna Maya.
In the summer of 2019, a group of San Diego teens took an educational trip to Israel. They visited the cities of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and all the best touristic spots in the Holy Land. About halfway through the trip, they decided to go take a visit to the southern city of Sderot. And Sderot is in the Gaza Strip. And the Gaza Strip is basically a territory occupied by 2 million Palestinians, and it is also governed by an internationally recognized terrorist organization called Hamas. They initially went to Sderot to go visit this special underground bunker disguised as a playground for kids to go visit when chaos would break out in the area so that they'd have a home away from home or this sense of safety in the bunker. While the teens were watching the introductory video of the bunker, a chayal, an Israeli soldier, ran across the production and alerted the teens that they had to evacuate immediately. As the teens ran onto the bulletproof bus, they sat in awe and silence as this big, gray, scary cloud of smoke rose into the air. That's when Sderot was attacked by a rocket, and I was one of those teens on that bus. But why was I in Israel in the first place? The tiny country in the Middle East is actually incredibly important to my people, the Jewish people. My ancestors escaped Turkey and Syria due to persecution and ended up in Mexico City with barely $1 in their pockets. From there, they found similar Jewish people with similar refugee status, and ended up moving all to Tijuana with the initial goal of making it into the United States. After lots of hard work and funding, they ended up moving into the United States, and they created the Ken Jewish community, which is now in San Diego and has over 400 Mexican Jewish families a part of it. My freshman year of high school, I was even offered the chance to represent the Ken on an educational trip to Israel with 16 other teens who were also each representing their own Jewish communities in San Diego. My peers and I traveled to Israel initially to learn about its rich history and culture. Yet, when the rocket attack occurred in Sderot, our scheduled plans for the day were completely canceled, and instead we had to relocate to an exchange student high school in northern Tel Aviv. I remember none of us could sleep that night, and we were all on their phone with our parents, telling them that we're okay and that everything will be fine. We reflected on the incident, and we spoke about how weird it was for us and how the encounter was so foreign, yet so common for every other citizen living in Israel. We also talked about the tension in the Middle East overall and how it wasn't portrayed the way it is in Western media. That's when I would like to say I speak on behalf of those 16 other teens, cultivated this newfound love and passion for Israel. We discovered new aspects about our Jewish identity, and from then on, we all know we had to do something about this to work towards peace. I very quickly found out as well that I needed to also spend time fighting hate at home. Before high school, I attended a private K-8 Jewish school in San Diego called San Diego Hebrew Day School. Growing up with the same 26 Jewish faces every day, although comfortable and created long-lasting bonds, unfortunately did not prepare me to set foot on a public high school campus with over 500 kids in my grade alone. The transition from Hebrew Day to Bonita was no doubt quite difficult for me, and I realized that every aspect of who I was completely changed. I couldn't even remember the last time I made a friend, so that was very nerve-wracking for me. But luckily, I was incredibly lucky to find such a welcoming committee at Bonita Vista. Overall, freshman year was good to me. I made good friends and I excelled in school. Very quickly, I realized that I was one of the only Jewish students, but I was excited to teach my new friends about my identity and Judaism. I could go on and on about all the different Jewish traditions and holidays and ancestry and history. Additionally, I am a Latin Jew. While my identity is not rare to me or to anyone else from my community, none of my friends have ever met a person like me, let alone a Jew who says that they are publicly a Jew. I found out that that's what people enjoyed about me, my identity, and that they were interested in who I was. And thanks to Hebrew Day, I developed these great speaking skills to talk about anything Judaism and Israel related. Things changed quickly. Only a few months into the year, the people I called my friends became a little too comfortable with my identity. They talked about it to other people, and some people I didn't even know. I began receiving direct messages through Instagram from those friends and even new people, and all of that content was just anti Semitic photos and videos, even memes that made fun of the Holocaust, which was a genocide that led to the death of 6 million Jews. People sent me disturbing jokes that made fun of the Jewish people, yet at the time, I tried not to get upset. I tried to mind my own business, and I eventually ended up making new friends. I am sad to say that finding a new friend group did not end the anti-Semitism I was facing. I experienced something very strange happen to me my 9th grade year in my human geography class. We were covering a unit on identities and experiences throughout the world, and our teacher told us to write down all adjectives we would use to describe ourselves on a blank piece of paper. Words such as woman, Latina, Jewish, Arabic, Turkish were written all over my paper, and I was completely happy and satisfied with it. Later on, we had to gather in groups and talk about what we wrote down on our paper, and I was not ready to experience what I did. I was told that I am a liar because it is impossible to have so many adjectives, and that it wasn't possible, that it didn't exist. There was even a specific student who told me to just pick one and keep it simple. The worst part, though, was that I was incredibly embarrassed and misunderstood, and this was all exasperated by my teacher remaining silent. I felt incredibly frustrated due to the lack of representation I had within the classroom. I wish I could say that the anti-Semitism ended there, but during my sophomore year, I vividly remember walking into the women's restroom and seeing a swastika engraved front and center on the bathroom stall. That's when I said enough. No more memes, jokes, videos, photos, or swastikas. I had to do something to combat this hate. I began working with Jewish teens across the country, and we listened to each other's experiences and empowered each other to address the anti-Semitism we were all individually facing within our communities. When I gained the courage to stand up, the Bonita administration was actually incredibly supportive of this. I was finally able to educate others about anti-Semitism and work towards ending this hate. I am simply trying to express to the public, to you, how anti-Semitism manifests today. It is unfortunately so common and so persuasive that it is dangerous to us Jewish people. According to the FBI, hate crimes against Jews comprised 60.2% of all religion-based hate crimes during 2019. Jews make up only 1.7% of the general population. Therefore, these numbers are incredibly absurd and scary. Since these incidents, I got incredibly involved within the Jewish community here in San Diego. I joined an Israel educational organization called Stand With Us and embarked on a year-long journey to learn how to combat anti-Semitism and everything Israel related. I received a leadership position at the Ken Jewish community, and I even founded an Israel club at Bonita Vista. I have attended numerous conferences and seminars and have given presentations to high school students and Jewish communities nationwide about the importance of Jewish representation within a classroom environment. And now, expanding my voice outside the Jewish community, I now have a seat on the Student Advisory Committee of the Sweetwater Union High School District, where I now have the opportunity to carry our voice as high school students. My passion comes down to one thing: education. I really believe that education is the road to peace, and through education, we will learn to listen and understand each other. I remember being a Stand With Us intern for less than a month or so until I was introduced to the Ethnic Studies model curriculum issue, which was shortly after the first public comment of the curriculum, where there were over 20,000 critics. So basically, ethnic studies, although it's not a graduation requirement for high schoolers, it is an optional class high school students throughout California can now take part in. This is when I began educating myself on the contents within the curriculum, only to find pure bias and exclusivity, which is when I knew I had to speak up about it, especially if this was going to be taught to high school students like myself. An ethnic studies class in high school could benefit so many students. This course can provide the education they need to understand, appreciate, and respect people different from themselves. Instead of turning a blind eye and saying, oh, this person is different than me, or oh, this person doesn't look like me, I truly believe an adequate ethnic studies high school course can lay a foundation where students can learn and understand and respect other people different from themselves. This will benefit them so much more throughout their lives so that we don't face the discrimination we unfortunately do so today. I have written letters and articles on why inclusive ethnic studies can help fight anti-Semitism. I have met with elected officials and education officials to share my story and how my identity was excluded from this curriculum. The California Department of Education had said that curriculum will focus on 4 foundational groups, which include the African American population, the Asian American population, the Chicano or Latinx population, and the Native American, which leaves out pretty much all other ethnicities unless they come up as a subcategory for those 4. After speaking up and spreading awareness about the criteria within the first draft of the curriculum, and after seeing slight improvement within the second, us Jewish students knew we had to give it our all to get our inclusion within the third draft of the Ethnic Studies model curriculum. I would stay countless hours working on speeches and scripts like these so that I could present to elected officials throughout San Diego, even throughout the nation. Although, after our final push and after the release of the third draft of the curriculum, we realized that our words didn't make the cut. There was no definition of anti-Semitism included within the curriculum, which was one of the main guidelines we urged to be included, even though Islamophobia and racism were clearly defined, which have every right to be there. It was just quite upsetting to see that anti-Semitism wasn't defined. Unfortunately, now there's nothing we can do on the statewide level. All change must come from district-wide levels. We live in a world, in a society, where fighting for our equality and representation is the norm. It has only been 76 years since Nazi Germany began gathering Jewish men, women, and children and putting them on death row. Yet 63% of the average population ages 6 to 39 had no clue 6 million of us were exterminated. If this sentiment and attitude continues, how will we remember our history to prevent genocides like the Holocaust to ever happen again? At what point does ignorance become more dangerous than hate? When we fix this, not if, when we rid this energy and attitude, everything will be better. As powerful as Generation Z is, especially when it comes to transmitting inclusivity to others, until we rid of this idea of, oh, I was raised like this and I don't know much better than to discriminate, until we adapt to the idea of accepting others for who they are as a generation, we can be certain our kids will grow up in the world we so aspire to have. Just like Martin Luther King Jr. spoke out for those with darker colored skin, and just like Susan B. Anthony spoke out for women of all races, and seeing their difference impact us, it would be so nice to believe that as a Gen Zer, we can bring a similar change to our descendants and future families. Until the cycle is completed and until this goes full circle, we will know peace. I am only 17 years old, and I believe I have accomplished so much. The struggles and the obstacles I have overcome have made me who I am today, and I wouldn't have it any other way. I will continue my involvement within the San Diego Jewish community and hopefully find other communities to participate in. I have only 1 more year of high school, and I aspire to have more attendees and fun events occurring at my Israel Club. I have also decided to stay involved within the Stand With Us community for 1 more year, going into my senior year. And I will continue to speak on behalf of the student body within the Sweetwater Union High School District as a member of the Student Advisory Committee, and hopefully work with bordering districts as well. I am young, I am Jewish, and I am proud. And thank you for listening to my TED Talk.
Our next speaker was met with the untimely death of her 16-year-old brother Quinn due to medical malpractice at the age of 9. She was forced to cope with emotions and experiences that some adults still haven't encountered. Now, she's the CEO of the Quinn Murphy Foundation, a nonprofit that her family created just 5 months after Quinn's death. Today, she will tell the story of her journey through grief and hope in her speech, The Moment of Impact. Please welcome Miss Brianna Murphy.
The moment of impact. Try to recall that moment in your life, a moment that changed you and how you relate to others. These moments may occur in a fraction of a second, but they have the power to change the path you take, who you love, what you are passionate about. No moment is ordinary. These moments might seem insignificant, and if you blank for a second, you might miss it. Like the time my classmate asked a question in class. She was full of joy and wonder for learning. Then that moment came for her when she heard someone across the room say, "That's a stupid question." All of a sudden, she faded into the background. There are positive moments too, like receiving a kind comment or a promotion, anything that creates a chain reaction. But then there are those that are seared into our consciousness, like the impact of losing someone you love. These moments of impact can drastically diverge our path, and often we are not prepared for them. They can make or break us. You may begin to ask yourself, who will I become? What will I do despite it? My moment of impact brought me to my knees, and even today I struggle. 11 years ago, on Wednesday, January 27th, I woke up to the sound of my mother's voice outside my window. She was on the phone. It was a school day. By now, she would have already pulled the covers off of me, trying to get me out of bed. Who was she talking to? I focused on her words, but they didn't make sense to my 9-year-old brain. Through her sobs, I hear her say, "Not his eyes. Not his eyes. I'm not donating his eyes." I knew in my heart she was talking about my brother, Quinn, who had been in the hospital with severe abdominal pain nobody could diagnose. The last time I saw him was days ago, when I took him his favorite drink when he was feeling particularly sick. The confusion didn't last long. When I looked up, my eldest brother, Chris, was standing in the doorway. His eyes were red. He laid down next to me and spoke words that pierced through me. "You know how Quinn was sick? He didn't make it." That was the moment. I threw the comforter over my head and became completely silent. My parents had been taking turns in the hospital nights and days on end. I knew it was bad, but nobody told me it was this bad. It was a stomach ache, the doctors assured. The autopsy and medical files came back, and my family's pain and heartache grew worse. That stomach ache had been diagnosed weeks before he passed, and his death was entirely preventable. He had a bowel blockage, otherwise known as intussusception. Nothing prepared me for this loss and the grief that followed. I pulled the blanket over me because this thought was too big for me to handle. My brother, the person I spent every day with, shared a bunk bed with, was never coming home. I would never see him again. I put up a protective wall around me. If I could hide in the darkness and silence, maybe there was a chance this pain might go away. The ordinary moments that followed taught me vital lessons. The first lesson came from my grandmother's wisdom. Take the first step towards strength. Just after my brother Chris had delivered the news, she came and sat at the foot of my bed. I couldn't make words come out, nor could I reveal my face. Instead, I stuck my hand out to hold hers. I wanted nothing more than to stay there in silence forever. but she got me out of bed. She wasn't going to let me fade into the darkness. Her encouragement led me to face reality despite the pain that it brought. The next lesson was courage. My brother's wake was a few days later. I had so much anxiety. I did not want to hear, "I'm so sorry. How are you? Are you okay?" I had not cried. I was terrified of breaking down. But when I walked into the sea of people, I saw my dad. In that instant, I dropped the shield. I ran to him, and I collapsed in his arms, sobbing. I did not hide. I allowed myself to be vulnerable. Author Brené Brown says, "Vulnerability is having the courage to show up and be seen when we have no control of the outcome." Vulnerability is not weakness. It's our greatest measure of courage. As the months passed, I continued to grieve and learn. At one point, I began to bargain with God, conjuring a plan where Quinn would be with us for 6 months, then heaven for the next 6 months. We would take turns. It made perfect sense. I had no doubt that God would agree. Everyone wins. I bargained for weeks, praying night and day for Quinn to visit us. I was in the thick of my grief without even realizing it. My life revolves around using calendar apps to help me stay on a tight schedule. But there's one thing I will never be able to plan for: grief. It feels like waves crashing over me. Some waves I can float over, but others almost drown me. Grief author Brooke Knoll calls this ambushes of grief. When at any odd moment, grief hits you suddenly, and it feels like the death just occurred. Grief brutally imposed its will on me, and it left me no option other than to face it. I realized that fighting it or hiding from it did not make it go away. But how does one accept such pain? How could I turn my grief into an old friend that comes to visit now and then? I realized I was closer to acceptance when years later I was asked to complete a writing assignment about the most memorable day of my life. Most of my classmates chose happy memories. I decided to write about the day my brother died, my moment of impact. I realize now that the times we remember the most aren't always happy. They leave us with a deep scar, but teach us lessons. Steve Leder, author of The Beauty of What Remains, encourages us to learn over and over again how death teaches us to live in this moment with those of us left behind. My brother taught me to be a strong and courageous person, and those lessons did not end when he died. Although grief remains with me, it now pushes me to rise above, telling me to choose hope over and over again. Quinn has become the core of my inner strength. One of Quinn's favorite books was The Way of the Peaceful Warrior. In it, there's a quote: "In this life, there are no ordinary moments." I learned this the hard way, but I accept it now because I know these moments and scars inspire knowledge, wisdom, and courage. I can now build a new relationship with Quinn, one of admiration and respect for everything he taught me while he could. During our grieving, my family taught me that tragedy can inspire positive action. In 2010, they created the Quinn Murphy Foundation, a community-based nonprofit that has continued to grow and bring positivity to the South Bay, giving over $155,000 in scholarships. Last year, we reached our 10th year of operation, and my father decided it was time he passed the torch to me. I now am acting executive director of the Quinn Murphy Foundation. There are no ordinary moments. Losing my brother, my moment of impact, made me who I am today. It taught me courage and strength from sadness, life from loss. It will continue to influence me and teach me each and every day for the rest of my life.
Thank you, Brianna. Our next speaker is a native San Diegan who currently works as the marketing manager for the San Diego History Center in Balboa Park. She currently leads the Share Your Story program, which is dedicated to archiving the stories of San Diegans during the COVID-19 pandemic. Please welcome Ms. Shelby Gordon with her speech titled COVID-19's Historic Silver Lining.
I started my job as the marketing manager for the San Diego History Center on February 24th, 2020. I was excited to be a part of a team that would elevate the history of my hometown, tell the stories of its challenges and successes, its flaws and its beauty. I was excited to be able to tell the stories of San Diego's heroes and game changers. My very first day on the job, I said to my new boss, we need to keep monitoring this issue with the coronavirus. I think I had a gut feeling that the situation was something different. It was something that was going to be like nothing we had faced before. Nothing like earthquakes or wildfires. Nothing like economic downturns or social justice protests. And indeed, 3 weeks later, while sitting in a meeting, we received word that the World Health Organization had declared the coronavirus a pandemic. And closely thereafter, we received word that many of the local school districts were switching to online learning. Well, that changed things. The physical doors of our museums in Balboa Park and Presidio Park closed to the public. Our teams, who primarily had been focused on welcoming guests into our physical spaces, had to switch to thinking digital first. We started working remotely, meeting every day, struggling with the technology, and not really knowing how long this would be our status quo. We quickly realized a few key challenges. One, we had content that could assist educators and families struggling to navigate a new solar system of distance learning. How do we make that content available to the masses? And how could we make that happen fast? Number two, we had photos of the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic in our photo collection. We had the ability to tell the story of San Diegans' resilience through that world-changing event. But what really came to light for us was that we at the San Diego History Center had the opportunity to capture history happening now, today. We certainly had a mandate to do this based on our organization's mission to preserve and promote the history of our region. But we also really had an obligation to leverage the tools available to us, digital and relational, to capture the insights, reflections, and artifacts of San Diegans living through the coronavirus pandemic, to capture the insights of the history happening now. We launched a website called History Happening Now, Share Your Story, and we invited the public to submit their San Diego perspective of COVID-19 and living through COVID-19. We were amazed by the response. People of all ages, from all backgrounds, representing all parts of San Diego County, were submitting their thoughts on the abrupt shift in their daily lives, their shock about the abrupt closures and quarantine, and their despair about the deadly nature of the virus, their concern for fellow San Diegans, and their pride in our city as we coalesced as a community to protect each other and to support our healthcare workers and frontline responders. For me, what started as a marketing job for 2 museums and beautiful landmarks in the city I love became a passion project to make the history of our city, dynamic and personal and reflective of not just what had happened in the past, but what was happening today. This, for me, was a way to ensure that 100 years from now, when San Diegans look back on this coronavirus pandemic, they would not only have photographs, but they would also have oral histories, diaries, journal, art, and artifacts that told a complete story of what our region has dealt with through the coronavirus pandemic, how we evolved to a life that we never asked for and never anticipated, a life of face masks, social distancing, and quarantine, of remote working, remote learning, and remote interaction with family and friends, of isolation and insulation, and also of inspiration as we continue to be amazed by the technology and science involved in understanding the virus, protecting us from the virus, and preventing further spread of the virus. A year later, our focus has expanded to invite the public to see their stories, the stories of their fellow San Diegans migrating through a year of lockdown, of watching COVID case numbers, of mourning those that we'd lost, and preparing for a life post-COVID. At the San Diego History Center a year later, we've learned how much the public wants to be a part of history happening now. They want their voices heard and documented. They want their voices and memories archived for researchers to study. They want what they love about this region captured in their very own words, thoughts, and pictures. And San Diegans, to this day, continue to submit to the Share Your Story initiative. We're incorporating the concept of collecting history in real time to other initiatives. It's becoming part of our standard operating procedure. We're sharing our learnings with other institutions who have been inspired by this concept and have launched similar initiatives. We have enhanced our permanent collection at one of the most crucial times in the region's history in a way that will become invaluable to future historians and researchers, as well as family and friends looking to this time for stories of resilience, adaptation, and inspiration. What we learned is that history is vibrant and dynamic. It's flexible, nimble, but most importantly, we learned how much San Diegans respect and want to invest in the history happening now, the history happening to them on a daily basis, in COVID, and I think post-COVID.
Our final speaker is a trustee scholar at the University of Southern California. As an aspiring physician, he understands the importance of the support systems we surround ourselves with and their effect on our well-being. Outside the classroom, he runs his own nonprofit organization, the Rush Foundation, which is dedicated to distributing technological needs to underdeveloped schools in third world countries. This is his second year as a TEDxBonita Vista High speaker, and we'd like to thank him for his continued dedication to our events. Please welcome Mr. Rishikesh Pandey with his speech, Who Supports You?
Before the pandemic, most of us had individuals that we talked to on a regular day-to-day basis. Friends, family, teachers, and even if you don't want to admit it, pets. We had interactions that we depended upon, quite frankly, to stay sane. In fact, we leaned on and relied on the support system that we had put into place, day in and day out. Yet, as soon as we were told to stay an arm's distance away, everything vanished. An arm's distance away quickly became light years away. The people that you had interacted with every single day seemingly became unapproachable. Conversations that once rolled off your tongue were hindered. as if you had lost the ability to speak. The support system that we had felt safe in was just a false sense of security. For most of us, no one was there. And that's my concern. Too often in our lives, we surround ourselves with a support system that doesn't quite do what we intend for it to do when we need it the most. We surround ourselves with a passive support system, one that's reactive, not proactive. It's time that we took a look and understood the pitfalls of how we construct our support systems and worked towards setting up a better, more active support system for ourselves. One that's there for us every day and when we need it the most. When thinking about surrounding yourself with a support system, it seems obvious and redundant for me to state that it does have tangible benefits, but it's worth saying the degree to which they help us. Dr. Uchino, chair of the Department of Psychology at the University of Utah, goes over exactly this in his book, Social Support and Physical Health: Understanding the Health Consequences of Relationships. He examines the effect of social relationships on physical health and assesses the research that shows not only that supportive relationships protect us from a multitude of health problems, but also that the absence of supportive relationships increases the risk of dying from various illnesses, including cardiovascular disease and cancer. And this is just one of the many studies. The importance of support systems is something that shouldn't be overlooked to begin with. And now that we've understood that they are indeed a necessity in our lives, we can shift towards understanding how exactly we form them. So, how do we set up these support systems? Well, the American Bar Association of Lawyers and Law Students has cleanly laid out that there are 3 core groups that make up a support system: family, friends, and professional colleagues. And these combined provide one of 4 types of social support. Emotional support is the entire realm of compassion and care, which are typically found within the sphere of your close friends and family. Instrumental support, we can think of tangible acts of service or help, provided which also usually come from our close friends and family. These 2 types of support are more along the lines of the personal ones that we tend to care about the most. The informational support is advice and mentorship, which can come from any of the 3 core groups, but more specifically the professional colleagues when dealing with career and development. And the last, but arguably the most important, is appraisal. We could characterize this as motivation towards getting better in the form of a gentle assessment of how you're doing in life, good or bad. These tend to come from your friends and family when dealing with personal development, and your professional relationships when dealing with career development. However, the distinction that I want to make here is that all of us tend to have these in our lives. As I was going through the various forms, most of you were filling out a mental checklist and thinking, oh, okay, I have that one and that one too. Yet, I urge you to look deeper. How many of those relationships within your support systems are really providing you with the support that you need, especially during these tough times? And that brings me to the crux of the issue and the heart of my concern. We are surrounding ourselves with support systems that are wholly, or in most aspects, passive, and not necessarily helping us along our path to success. That could mean only trying to benefit off your relationship when you succeed, or not readily being available when you need their help. Researchers at the James Cook University in Singapore found that passive support given to participants led to a decrease in determinedness and pleasantness after a stressful task in comparison to the active support. And I know that you're probably thinking, it's obvious. Of course, active and positive support is going to make me more determined to face challenges and help me be a better person. If it's so obvious, then why do most of us still have a passive support system? Right? If we know that those that support us actively help us progress in life, why might the majority of those in that mental checklist you made earlier help you passively? We have trouble letting go. At one point in time, sure, they may have been part of an active support system. But the most important part to understand is that this concept is a living thing. Your support system doesn't have to be, and isn't meant to be, stagnant and rigid with the same people over and over again. Rather, you can stay more in touch with the individuals that you feel encourage you to be your best self and adjust accordingly. It's a hard concept to implement, and I've had my fair share of struggles. The pandemic has created distance, and that distance has led to a lot of our support systems being more passive. I graduated high school during the pandemic, and a majority of my friends that I used to talk to every day slowly grew apart from me. And this is nothing new. It's known that your high school friends grow apart as you go to college. However, I felt that we needed each other during these tough times, since it was much harder to physically create a strong active support system in this new, unknown, online environment. And I realized that there was still some hope in rekindling those connections. I began to reach out to those that had been with me and supported me throughout my high school journey. And we shared updates on how college is going, study tips that we picked up through our online learning, and stories about some of the amazing new people we've met so far. Instead of letting my entire support system crumble due to distance, I made sure that I acknowledged those that had helped along my journey and offered my help through these difficult times. And through these difficult times, I've learned that it's up to us to preserve and better our support systems. Today, we've gone through how a support system can help us, what it's composed of, and the difference in an active and passive one. We even questioned our own current systems along the way, and understood that it's up to us to recognize and better them. So go out into the world and look for meaningful connections, ones that add to your active support system. Be there for others just as they would for you.
That concludes today's conference. Thank you again to all of our speakers and everyone involved in this effort. We appreciate everyone who came today and supported our event. Hopefully, you leave today's conference empowered to improve yourself and the world around you. From our team to you, we hope today inspires you to weather the storm